Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. We are from Group 3, the Honorable Mahmud Maina MPD as the lecturer of Second Language Acquisition. In this video, we are going to discuss about Chapter 8, the Universal Hypothesis and Second Language Acquisition. Well, the members of our group are, my name is Nurul Maskana and my partners are Novita Anggraini, Nazif Alfaki Ahmad, Putri Ayu Hapso, Oki Dayensa, and Tiwi Noviani. Well, my friends, in this video, I would like to introduce to you this chapter. Okay, let me start from the introduction. Here are the possibilities of determinants of SLA. The first, we have learner's first language or L1. As we have learned before in the previous chapter, L1 determines the SLA. Seperti yang sudah kita pelajari dalam chapter sebelumnya, L1 atau bahasa pertama itu mempengaruhi dari SLA dalam pembelajaran SLA. Okay. The second one is input or interaction. It is also possible to determine the SLA. And then the third one is learner strategies. As we have discussed before, learner strategies influence the determinants of SLA. And then the last is the target and the native language. Okay, this is the last possibility that can determine the SLA. Okay, and then we have purpose and key concept. Let me start from the purpose of this chapter. The purpose of this chapter is to explore to what extent these regularities can be accounted for in terms of purely linguistic properties which influence how interlanguages can develop. Oke, jadi di chapter ini kita akan mengeksplor apa saja regularity yang bisa mempengaruhi dan bagaimana interlanguage itu bisa berkembang. Nah, okay, let's start from the key concept of this chapter. The key concept of this chapter is linguistic universal. I will explain more about linguistic universals, starting from the explanations to SLA. There are two ways explanations to SLA of linguistic universals. First one, or the first way, the linguistic properties of the target language vary in how difficult they are to acquire, according to whether they are universal or language specific. The approach involves a comparison of the target language. Jadi dari cara pertama ini, pendekatannya itu mempengaruhi dari perbandingan antara target language atau bahasa yang ingin dicapai. And then the second is involves a comparison of the target and native language. Nah, jadi kalau yang cara pertama itu cuma mempengaruhi memperbandingkan target language-nya saja. The second way atau jalan kedua itu membandingkan antara target dan native language atau bahasa asing. Bukan bahasa asing, tapi bahasa native, bahasa yang dikuasai. Okay, the use of linguistic universal. First, it can help to overcome one of the major problems of the contrastive analysis hypothesis. Not all the linguistic differences between the native and target languages result in learning difficulty. And then, the second, to help predict which differences lead to difficulty and which ones do not. Thus, the study of linguistic universals has helped to revamp transfer theory. Okay, and then the third one is the role of universals in L1 acquisition with regard to their effects on granima or formation and on L1 transfer. Finally, some of the problems of the universal hypothesis are discussed. Okay, it will be discussed more with the next presenter. Well, The fourth is according to Chomsky, for example, in 1965, 1980, and 1981. It's possible to discover the highly abstract principles of grammar that constrain the form of any specific grammar. He refers to these principles as universal grammar. Nah, jadi part universal grammar ini akan lebih dijelaskan oleh the next presenter. And then the last part is according to Greenberg, 1966, and this following in his path, for example, in 1981, it's identifying universals by examining a wide range of languages from different language families in order to discover what features they have in common. It refers to typological universals, which also will be discussed more with the next presenters. Well, that's all the introduction from me. I hope you can get the point and you can understand more about this chapter. And please watch this video until end. Okay, thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Next presenter, time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Oki Dayansa. I will continue the explanation. Universal grammar. What is universal grammar? Universal grammar is the theory in linguistics usually credited to Noam Chomsky, proposing that the ability to learn grammar is hard, where into the brain endowment as universal. Universal grammar is the system of categories, operations, and principles shared by all human language and considered to be innate. In linguistics, the theory of universal grammar holds that there are certain basic structural rules that govern language that all humans know without having to learn them. This is one way to explain how humans acquire language. If the brain is already primed to understand certain sentence structure, it explains how children can understand and speak sentences that they've never heard before. Next is universal grammar argument. There are three arguments. First, property of the stimulus. Second, constraint and principle cannot be learned. And the last is pattern of development are universal. Property of the stimulus. In this argument, there are 3 points. First, children heard only a finite number of sentences. Second, they are able to abstract the rules and principles of the language. And the last, they produce an infinite number of possible sentences without any formal training. Constraint and principle cannot be learned. In this argument, there are 3 points. First, children are very young when acquiring L1. Second, they do not have the cognitive ability to understand the principle of grammar as a system. And the last, because of innate capacity, they are capable of producing correct grammar. Patterns of development are universal. In this argument, children learn the various aspects of language in a very similar order. Next is typological universal. Typological universal is a universal derived from an investigation of the commonalities of the world's language. The goal is to determine similarities in types of language, including implicational universal. Next, implicational universal. Implicational universal is common hierarchies across the world's language in which particular language elements are predicted by the existence of other language elements.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nazif Al-Faqih Ahmad. In this opportunity, I'd like to explain about linguistic universals and L1 acquisition, and then linguistic universals and second language acquisition. Let's go first to linguistic universals and L1 acquisition. The relationship between linguistic universals and L1 acquisition has been most thoroughly explored in terms of universal grammar. The relationship between universal grammar and L1 acquisition is a necessary one, as Chomsky's primary justification for universal grammar is that it provides the only way of accounting for how children are able to learn their mother tongue. A linguistic universal is a pattern that occurs systematically across natural languages, potentially true for all of them. For example, all languages have nouns and verbs, or if a language is spoken, it has consonants and vowels. Universal grammar is the solution to what is called the logical problem of language acquisition. The child needs to be constrained from forming incorrect hypotheses. These constraints are not provided by the input data, so they must be part of the child's biologically determined endowment. Without universal grammar, of course, it wouldn't be possible for a child to acquire a language successfully. Zobel is interested primarily in second language acquisition, but considers it important to take L1 acquisition as his starting point. Many of the claims made for language universals in L1 acquisition will hold true across acquisition types. A useful starting point for considering the role of universals in second language acquisition is to list the various points that have been raised in this discussion of L1 acquisition. Those points are: number one, grammar construction is constrained by the operation of universal grammar, which regulates the options the child has to choose from. That is, hypothesis formation is constrained by innate principles. Number two, regularities in the order of development can be explained only by considering both universal grammar and channel capacity. A distinction can be made between development or actual progress and acquisition, or the idealized learning that results from universal grammar. Number three, universal grammar may unfold as a maturational schedule, as suggested by Felix in 1984, or it may be activated piecemeal in accordance with the data that the child perceives at different developmental stages, as suggested by White, 1981. Number four, the child is likely to learn unmarked rules before marked rules. He constructs a core grammar before a peripheral grammar. And the last point, number five, is the child possesses a projective capacity. This enables one rule to trigger off other rules with which it is implicationally linked, and also enables rules to be acquired when no direct evidence for them has been supplied by the input. Well, after linguistic universals and L1 acquisition, now we go to linguistic universals and second language acquisition. The principles of universal grammar are still available to the adult and are relevant to second language acquisition. Thus, Word 1984 argues that the learnability axiom needs to be reconceptualized so that it unrestricted with regard to age, acquisition type, and situation. It must be assumed that there is a single mechanism for learning languages. The role of linguistic universals in second language acquisition is more complicated than in first language acquisition or L1 acquisition. This is because second language involves two languages. They are the target language and the learner's native language. Thus, the second language learner brings two types of linguistic knowledge to the task of second language acquisition. The second language learner brings his knowledge of linguistic universals and the specific grammar of his first language. Furthermore, he must presumably know which rules in his first language belong to the core and which to the periphery. Okay, that's all from me. Move to the next presenter.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Tiwino Piani, and now I will explain to you about linguistic universals in interlanguage development. And the purpose of this section is to consider how and to what extent linguistics universals contribute to interlanguage development. It will begin by examining a number of theoretical questions and then review a number of empirical studies. Okay, for the first of the theoretical question concern the relationship between linguistic universals and channel capacity in SLA. It will be recalled that Chomsky argues that universal grammar interacts with other faculties responsible for channel capacity in L1 acquisition. In SLA, however, it's not clear whether the learner is subject to the same maturational constraints as the child. The assumption that cognitive processes are not involved in SLA, however, may not be justified. Channel capacity still seems to play a part in some aspect of SLA. For example, L2 learner display the ability to produce very long utterances right from the beginning of SLA. They are still likely to resort to semantic simplifications. Okay, for the second theoretical issues concern hypothesis testing. In chapters 3 and 7, hypothesis testing was seen as one of the central processes in interlanguage development. And empirical studies have examined three related hypotheses to do with the effect of universals in interlanguage development. These are: the first, interlanguage, like other natural languages, is subject to the constraints imposed by linguistic universals. The second, implicational universals, can be used to predict the order in which properties of the L2 appear in interlanguage. The third, L2 learners learn unmarked or less marked properties before marked or more marked properties of the target language. According to Schmidt, 1980 set out to examine whether interlanguage was constrained by language universals. She looked at how L2 learners from 5 different language backgrounds delete elements from coordinate structures in language. And the basic types of deletion possible in English are shown in Table 8.2. Data were collected using 4 different tags, but the most difficult type of deletion proved to be 3 because object deletion is more marked than subject or verb deletion. Okay, you can see in this slide there are 3 types of deletion. The first is subject delete from coordinate clause. For example, John sang a song and played a guitar. The second, verb delete from coordinate clause. For example, John plays the piano and Mary the violin. The third, object deleted from main clause. For example, John typed and Mary mailed the letter. And also, there have been several studies that have investigated whether the Markner scale is able to predict the order of development in SLA. There is evidence to show that universals place constraints on interlanguage, that acquisition may follow the hierarchical ordering of features, and that unmarked or less marked features are acquired before marked or more marked features. However, it would be premature to draw definite conclusions, both because of the paucity of available research and also because there are a number of theoretical problems. Okay, I think enough from me. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to continue the explanation. Relationship between signification theory and L1 transfer. unmarked setting, parameter will appear in interlanguage before the marker setting, even if L2 provided proof of arrangement. Unmarked setting permanent will appear in interlanguage before the marker setting, even if L2 provides proof of arrangement. Mother tongue shows unmarked setting and marked target language. Unmarked settings are settings that may be expected to read place if the student value universal grammar. Okay, next, how to claims. First is line unmarked from transfer to interlanguage, and the second, the form marked L1 is not transferred to interlanguage. Transfers of unmarked forms L1 job 9083 9084 argues that transfer have only as half evaluation size. Next, non-transfer formulate berstanda L1 show that students tend to avoid not one-to-one correspondence between L1 and L2 when meaning is considered for two types, although errors and occur. Clement 97.9. Next. Less ambiguous evidence to avoid the market form in L1 transfer is provided by Job 9084. He investigate French L1 or L2. English learner use how much construction French permission, extraction of noun phrase modified by combined vowels and the orange. Combine the orange vowels, whereas English doesn't. How many orange do you want? How many orange do you want? Job agrees that non-extraction represent and unsigned rules and the marks extraction. A group of low-level French learners from the English show a strong preference for unstructured rules. However, there is also counter evidence. Liceras 1983 investigate prepositions trending. Example: who did John give the books to? In English, learners speak Spanish L2.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Novita Anggraini. So today I would like to continue the explanation. It's about some problems with the universal hypothesis. It is intuitively plausible that SLA is at least in part determined by purely linguistic factors to do with the L1 and L2. The universal hypothesis is an attempt to explain how these factors operate in interlanguage. It presupposes that there is a relationship between language universal and SLA, such that features that are universal or show a strong tendency to be universal will be easy to learn and so will be learned early. So there are some problems with the universal hypothesis. The first is linguistic universal must be seen to have psycholinguistic validity if they are to be treated as the determinant of SLA. That is, it must be assumed that language universals are as they are because of the way the human mind works. It is these assumptions that underlies Chomsky's concept of universal grammar as an innate faculty in the mind. The second problem is a problem related to number 1, concerning the distinction between acquisition and development. There are 2 points to be made. The first is it is not clear how the two can be separated, as there are no reliable means for deciding what aspect of language learning is constrained by the language faculty and what aspects are constrained by cognitive faculties. And then the second is there seems no obvious reason for preferring to look at acquisition rather than development, at least as far as the development psycholinguistic is concerned. The third is Chomsky's theory of universal grammar relies on the poverty of the stimulus argument. Chomsky argued that input was degenerate and therefore could not provide an adequate data basis for setting the parameters of a language. The fourth is, according to Kellerman 1984, refers to the cavalier attitude to markedness. It is perhaps not surprising that the same phenomena are classified as unmarked by one researcher and marked by another. For example, according to White, 1984, says Prodrop, or a rule that specifies that the subject pronoun can be deleted from a sentence as the mark from, while according to Hyams 1983 says it is unmarked. There is also a danger of circularity. An unmarked parameter is one that is fixed early, while a parameter that is fixed early is unmarked. The last problem is a methodological one. Chomsky is concerned with describing and explaining competence. SLA researchers are more often than not concerned with carrying out empirical research, which must necessarily involve them in examining performance. These various criticisms do not invalidate the universal hypothesis. They suggest that at the moment its explanatory power may be limited, and they point to methodological difficulties in examining it empirically. And then the last explanation is about summary and conclusion. The universal hypothesis states that there are linguistic universals which determine the course of SLA as follows. The first is linguistic universals impose constraints on the form that interlanguage can take. And then the second is learners find it easier to acquire patterns that conform to linguistic universals than those that do not. The linguistic markedness of L2 rules explain the development road. And then the third is where the L1 manifests linguistic universals, it is likely to assist interlanguage development through transfer. Linguistic universals have been investigated by the in-depth study of a single language. Those working in this tradition argued that there is a universal grammar that constrains the kind of hypothesis that the learner can form and what that it is innate. An alternative approach to investigating linguistic universals is to study a large number of languages from different language families in order to discover typological universals. In both L1 and L2 acquisition, the effect of linguistic universals has been investigated primarily in terms of markedness theory. This states that some rules are unmarked or weakly marked and others marked or more strongly marked. Various criteria have been proposed for determining the markedness of a rule. Chomsky proposed that an unmarked rule is one that requires no or minimal triggering from the environment. A typological universal of a strong universal tendency can also be considered as unmarked. There is some evidence to suggest that language acquisition proceeds by mastering the easier unmarked properties before the more difficult marked ones. In SLA, there is also some evidence to suggest that when the L2 rule is marked, the learner will turn to his L1, particularly if this has an equivalent unmarked rule. So far, the evidence in support of the universal hypothesis is inconclusive. There are a number of theoretical and methodological problems. In particular, the hypothesis tends to discount pragmatic explanations and ignores variability in interlanguage.
Okay, I think that's all from our explanations. If you have any question, please feel free to ask to our group. Thank you for watching. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.